comrades, this is our video for week 11, day 1. Our subject is Soviet dissidents and our teaching assistant is Maggie. Let's start with some announcements. By now I hope that you have given some thought to your final papers in terms of choosing a topic. If you'd like to review the assignment and the list of prompts, you can find that on the course website under assignments. And if you want to create your own topic, you can do that, but you need to get my approval. And you should absolutely do that by Wednesday of this week at the latest. Let's see. Oh, we're losing our teaching assistant already. She is dissenting from the dissidents, which is quite a position to take, I must say. Okay, so there are two assignments coming up to do, or two things coming up to do with your final paper assignment in the near future. First, your introduction and outline are going to be due on Sunday, April 19th at 5 p.m. You should submit them on Sakai. So remember, your introduction should be 1 paragraph long, and it should include your thesis statement. That will be the answer that you give to the question and the prompt that you've chosen to answer. And your outline should have a good level of detail to it so that we can then sort of talk through your ideas together. And if you want to review what goes into an introduction and generally to review how to write a paper well, I invite you to look at the History 240 writing handout, which is under Writing Resources on the course website. So that's the first thing, to get that turned in by the 19th, your introduction and outline. The second thing is that I'm going to meet individually with each of you on Teams on Thursday, April 23rd or Friday, April 24th to talk through those materials with you. So I'm going to send up that sign-up sheet by email, and please remember to sign up for a meeting time. And let me know if you have any connectivity issues that mean you need to do the meeting by phone instead of by video chat. Either way is possible. Okay, our study of the Soviet dissident movement today is going to give us some insight into one of the less visible developments in the Soviet Union from the 1950s to the 1980s. The dissident movement was very much a product of the Khrushchev thaw. It started with like-minded friends hanging out at each other's apartments and talking about literature, philosophy, and social life. And that's something that would never have happened in the fear-driven atmosphere of the Stalin era. Khrushchev made it possible for these friends to find each other, while Brezhnev's harsh treatment of them politicized them. And by the late 1960s, they had become an opposition movement. And then in the 1970s, they turned into the Soviet human rights movement. Now, it's important to keep in mind that while the dissidents actively opposed Brezhnev's regime and its policies, they were not opposed to socialism or to the Soviet Union. This is reflected in the way that they refer to themselves. In English, we call them dissidents, but the word they used for themselves translates literally to other thinkers. So in other words, they didn't want to tear down the whole system. They wanted to reform it from within, to make it different, hopefully so that it would serve its citizens better. And it's worth considering how this goal of reform and renewal from within, fits with the ideals of Khrushchev's secret speech, which we're marking as sort of the genesis point for the dissident movement. As Alexeyeva recounts, from the start, the dissidents were eager readers of Novy Mir, the cutting-edge literary journal that we talked about last week. And in fact, their movement tracked closely with developments in Soviet literature, both official literature, what was published in journals and in books, and unofficial literature, which is passed around hand to hand in the Kompania that Alexeyeva describes. These are a few terms that are going to be useful for us in this context. The first is samizdat, which literally means self-published. Samizdat literature, as you read, was typed on a typewriter and passed around to friends, who would then read it, type up more copies, and pass it on to others. The second term is tamizdat, which literally means published over there. Tamizdat literature was smuggled across the Soviet border in manuscript form, published in Europe, and then smuggled back and passed around among friends. Finally, there is magnitizdat, which literally means published on tape. Magnitizdat recordings were made with tape recorders when people sang songs for each other at house parties, and they were again passed around among friends. So all of these are types of unofficial creative production that's being passed around among friends. And the people who sang the songs that appeared on magnitizdat recordings, they called themselves bards or guitar poets, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So from the late 1960s until the late 1960s, a series of events took place in Soviet literature which helped to politicize the dissidents. First, in 1958, Boris Pasternak was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his novel Dr. Zhivago, which had been published in Italy the year before. Because it was published abroad without government permission, Khrushchev forced Pasternak to turn down the prize. This was deeply shocking to people like Alexeyeva, who were proud of the achievements of Soviet literature and saw this situation as deeply unfair. In 1964, after Brezhnev had taken power from Khrushchev, the poet Joseph Brodsky was put on trial for being a quote-unquote parasite, or someone who doesn't work. Now, that is a real crime in the Soviet Union. Everybody has to have a job, everybody has to work. But Brodsky was writing plenty of poetry, and the government knew it. The thing is, he was writing his poetry only in samizdat, and using the anti-parasite law was the way that they were able to bring him to trial for doing that. And he was sentenced, in fact, he was convicted of parasitism and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In 1966, so just a couple of years later, two more writers, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, were tried and convicted of anti-Soviet propaganda for publishing novels in Tamizdat, and Alexeyeva writes about this some in the memoir. And in 1968, two more writers were tried and convicted for publishing a samizdat transcript of the Sinyavsky-Daniel trial, which they secretly recorded because the trial was not open to the public. So this series of events seems somewhat unbelievable. We're just having more and more trials of writers for anti-Soviet activities. But this is also an indication of how seriously Brezhnev's governments took these writers' activities. And it gives us a sense of how the growing antagonism between the two camps, the dissidents and the government, caused the dissidents to become increasingly politicized and oppositional. As the dissidents got more political, they also got more organized. Through the writers' trials, they became friends with Western foreign correspondents, and soon they began inviting them to improvised press conferences. They also held their first public protest, demanding that the state respect its own constitution. When writers were sent to the Gulag, they made connections with other opposition movements, which had two important results. First, in 1968, the dissidents began publishing a samizdat journal called the Chronicle of Current Events to publicize human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. And then in 1969, they formed the Initiative Group in Defense of Human Rights in the USSR to put pressure on the government to stop these abuses by bringing them to the attention of the wider world. So we're really seeing a professionalization and a more of an external face to the dissident movement now. International human rights law was essential to the dissidents' activities. They based their work on the claim that the Soviet government had violated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document created by the United Nations in 1948. In the 1970s, they got an important boost from the Helsinki Accords, an agreement signed by the Soviet Union, the United States, and various other European governments that included a provision allowing citizens to monitor their government's compliance with international human rights law. This was the basis for the Moscow-Helsinki Watch Group, of which Alexeyeva was a founding member. Among the dissidents, two different schools of thought developed. In today's reading, the liberal side is represented by Andrei Sakharov, and the conservative I have not written this well in my script. So the liberal side is represented by Andrei Sakharov, and the conservative side is represented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Sakharov was an elite scientist who had helped to develop the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb. By the 1960s, he came to believe that nuclear weapons were immoral. He publicly campaigned against them and advocated for the Soviet Union and the United States to put aside their differences and come together in peaceful world government. You can imagine that went down like a ton of bricks. Internationally, this won him the Nobel Peace Prize, but at home it meant he lost his job, his elite privileges, and he was eventually placed under house arrest. Solzhenitsyn, on the other hand, began his career as a math teacher in rural Russia. He served in World War II, but in 1945 he was arrested for making a joke about Stalin and sentenced to the Gulag. By the time he was granted amnesty, along with other prisoners in the mid-1950s, he had become a bitter opponent of the Soviet Union and communism, which he believed had corrupted Russia from its true path of paternalistic Christian monarchy. Although Khrushchev had allowed the publication of Solzhenitsyn's novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962, Solzhenitsyn was repressed by Brezhnev, and he was eventually forced to emigrate from the Soviet Union in 1974. As these short biographies attest, Soviet dissidents faced serious consequences for their activities. They lost their jobs, some went to prison, others were declared insane and imprisoned in mental institutions, and eventually many of them were forced to leave the Soviet Union, like Solzhenitsyn and Alexeyeva. Such repression wiped out the movement by the early 1980s. But Alexeyeva, Sakharov, and Solzhenitsyn hung on and became important political and intellectual figures in Russia in the late 1980s and after the Soviet Union's collapse. So it's worth thinking both about the short term and the long term when we assess the Soviet dissident movement. Okay, that's enough background. Time for some discussion questions. Number 1. On page 83 to 84, Alexeyeva describes the Campania as being not political. Do you agree with this assessment, or do you think that they were political in their own way? Was it possible in the context of the Soviet Union for any group of people to be apolitical, even under Khrushchev? Do you think that people who don't fit in will always find each other in any society? Number 2, let's talk about samizdat. Read over Alexeyeva's description on pages 97 to 100. How would you categorize the types of literature that were published this way? Based on this, what would you say the dissidents were looking for in pushing beyond the sphere of official literature? Samizdat also takes a lot of work to produce. Why do you think it was worth it for them to go to all of the trouble of typing something out, reading through, typing it through again? How would it change your relationship to a piece of literature if you typed it out yourself rather than just reading it? Number 3. Just after the description of samizdat, on pages 101 to 103, Alexeyeva talks some about Magnitizat and the bards, particularly Bulat Okudjava. Okudjava is typical of the bards. They thought of themselves as poets first and musicians second, and they even called themselves guitar poets. If the thing you're really interested in is the words, why bother to set it to music? Why become a guitar poet instead of just being a poet full stop? I put a link to Okudjava's song My Arbat on the course website. Listen to it while reading the words in Alexeyeva's translation. In your analysis, what, if anything, makes this song anti-Soviet? How does setting it to music change your relationship to the words? Number 4. Analyze the first Constitution Day protest in 1966, which was held in response to the trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel. The protest only lasted 5 seconds, and then everyone got arrested. But they also were released without charges, and a lot of people witnessed what they did. Do you consider this protest a success or a failure? In the invitation to the protest, which Alexeyeva reproduces on page 120, Alek Yesenin Volpin demands that everyone chant only one slogan and maintain strict decorum. Why are these things so important for this protest? Is he right to try to control it so closely? Number 5. The trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel is a sham, and they're convicted as everyone knows they will be. But Alexeyeva still finds triumph in this moment. Look at the way she phrases this on page 138. Why does she feel that this is a win for the dissidents, even though they're convicted? Does she convince you of her perspective? How does this situation set the tone for the development of the Soviet human rights movement? Number 6. The story of the Chronicle of Current Events really starts with the Sinyavsky and Daniel being sent to prison. Many people in Moscow offer to help, and in the prison camps they learn many more prisoners' stories that they want to publicize. Consider the origin of the Soviet human rights movement in the Campania of the late 1950s. How did that beginning give them the values and traditions that enabled them to make the Chronicle work? Why do you think they chose Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as their epigraph? What does it symbolize to them? Number 7. Let's turn to Sakharov's essay, Progress, Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom. In this essay, he asserts that the dangers facing human civilization are so enormous that we must set aside our political differences and work together through a scientific approach to solve them. In essence, he's putting a lot of faith in science and a lot of faith in humanity. Do you think his faith is justified? Will science and rationality lead us to solutions to the threats we face, many of which you might notice are the same ones that Sakharov identifies in the mid-1970s? Do you think either side in the Cold War would have been willing to compromise in the way that Sakharov expects, or is he too idealistic? Number 8. Sakharov identifies 3 major threats to freedom of thought, which he considers essential to human progress. Find the paragraph that begins, "But freedom of thought is under a triple threat." Read that paragraph and the next 2. Do these threats still exist in 2020? If so, how do they show up in your own experience? Sakharov says that combating them is the work of all people, but he reserves a special role for the intelligentsia. What would Lenin have thought of this idea? Does Sakharov convince you that the intelligentsia should in fact play a special role? Number 9. One of Sakharov's major claims in this essay is that de-Stalinization has not gone far enough. He provides specific new information, which was not in Khrushchev's secret speech. Considering what you've learned about the dissident movement, where do you think he got this information? What does his deployment of it tell us about the further consequences of the secret speech in Soviet society? Number 10. Solzhenitsyn's letter to the Soviet leaders takes a very different position. He begins by attacking the, quote, progressive ideology, which, he claims, Russia adopted from Europe and which has now led them both into a dead end. While Sakharov calls for more science and rationality, Solzhenitsyn calls for less science and a return to folk wisdom and traditional ways. Can you unpack Solzhenitsyn's argument here? Whose argument do you find more convincing, and why? Number 11. With fiery rhetoric, Solzhenitsyn denounces Marxism for being wrong in all of its predictions and promises. But he doesn't seem to be much of a fan of democracy either. Rather, he argues that authoritarian rule is the best and most natural form of government for Russia. Find the paragraph that begins with, quote, however, in those days an important condition was fulfilled. Read that paragraph and the next two closely. How does Solzhenitsyn use history to argue for his position? How might a Marxist, or even a fan of democracy, tell this history differently? Does Solzhenitsyn have a point about Russia having a unique path? Or should we see his position as an extreme reaction to his hatred for socialism? And my last question for you is, both Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn wrote these pieces in the early 1970s, at a time when Alexeyeva was actively working with the Initiative Group in Defense of Human Rights and publishing the Chronicle of Current Events. At this point, the dissident scene was vibrant and diverse, but it was also a small fraction of the population. So let's return to a question posed by our textbook authors. Does the existence of this movement contradict the notion that they were living during an era of stagnation? Or does the fact that they were tiny, isolated, and ultimately a repressed minority render them irrelevant? As always, I'm looking forward to your answers.